Right, well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to this impact engagement webinar. Today's theme or topic is risk, resilience and response in a changing climate, flooding and resilience during a pandemic. My name is Phil Eminson. I'm Head of Resilience at JBA Consulting, and I'm Chair of the Flood Resilience Professional Working Group at the Emergency Planning Society. You'll notice that I've got my headset on today, and that's really just to block out the background noise on my conservatory because it's absolutely thundering down with rain here. So hopefully we won't get too much distortion. So the theme really for today is how society and the built environment is responding to our changing climate. And we've seen climate extremes becoming more frequent. And just in this last week, we've seen the highest temperature record on Earth over in Death Valley in California. And locally in the UK, we're seeing warmer and wetter winters with increased storminess, leading to greater risks and vulnerabilities across society. In the last year alone, we've seen storms Kira and Dennis and Jorge cause flooding to thousands of properties, spanning from the southwest of England through South Wales, border counties such as Worcestershire and Shropshire, across into Yorkshire, and indeed over the border into Scotland. And just this last week, we've had thunderstorms and intense summer rainfall, which has brought flash flooding to many parts. So today we'll explore the challenges that climate change brings to society and our built environment, and the added pressures and layers of complexity that COVID-19 has introduced. So I'm delighted to chair today's conference, and we have a really exciting range of speakers lined up. My talk will be first, and I'm going to discuss current challenges and ambitions for the future. I'll then be followed by Kirsty McRae, who is the Property Flood Resilience Coordinator at the Scottish Flood Forum. And Kirsty's topic is entitled Improving the Flood Resilience of Scotland's Homes. Kirsty will be followed by Petra Bieberbach, who's from PAS, and Petra will be talking to us about enabling resilient communities. Our fourth speaker, delighted to have with us, is Shruti Jain, who is the Health Improvement Manager at Public Health Scotland. And Shruti will be talking to us about the role of the place standard in resilient communities. And finally, we've got Professor Branko Dimitrovic, who is Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the Department of Architecture at University of Strathclyde. And Branko will be talking about community engagement and a consultation case study. So by way of a little bit of housekeeping, there is a text chat available. Please do use that to interact and engage with us. We will roll from one speaker to a next between now and 12 o'clock. And then we'll spend the next 30 minutes between 12 and 12:30 recapping over any questions that have been posed in the text chat and opening the floor up for any new questions. So without further ado, I'll launch into my presentation. So let's have a look. Okay, hopefully you can all. There we go. Okay, so current challenges and ambitions for the future. So I was starting to plan this talk, and I was thinking about how we can prepare and build a nation that's ready for and resilient to the challenges that we face today and that we will face tomorrow. And so what I'm going to do is spend a little moment recapping and looking at some of the flood events that we faced in recent years. And then thinking about what resilience can look like. And we will never fully realise resilience. There will always be more to do from homeowners, communities, businesses, responders. And in doing that, we'll tease out what some of the challenges are. And then I will finish, I suppose, with some questions around what our ambitions could and should be when we're talking about climate change and preparedness. Okay, so a stark reminder then of the facts. Flooding, as we know, is one of the UK's biggest risks. And if you Google it, you will very quickly find that about 1 in 6 properties in the UK is at risk of flooding. And that means that about 5 million people live or work in properties that are at risk of flooding. I will come back to those stats actually towards the end, when I draw an analogy to a different hazard. And when we talk about these numbers, inevitably, as I mentioned in my opening preamble, the risks, the vulnerabilities that we face as a society will increase with climate change. But I pose the question: is it really the numbers that matter? And it is, of course, it is. But personally, I think we need to look deeper. Personally, I think it's the human stories that really matter. And sometimes, sitting in front of our computer screens, we often forget the true impact and devastation that flooding can bring. Just this last week, I've been visiting properties who were flooded back in February during Storm Dennis. Their recovery went straight into COVID lockdown, and many are still now living in temporary accommodation. Some have started to recover and rebuild, but many are still just engaging with loss adjusters and starting that process. And I could have put thousands of photos on here, but it wouldn't tell the true story and the devastation and the impact it has on livelihoods, mental health, and long-term recovery. But these photos are all from this year, from border counties like Shropshire, Yorkshire, indeed some are from north of the border, indeed into Scotland as well. And for me, that's why it matters. That's why I think we're all involved in the industries that we're in. It's about trying to prevent or minimise damage. We sadly we won't stop climate change. We can try and slow it down, but you know, heavy rainfall, intense thunderstorms are part of our weather system now, part of our climate. And so it's about how, as a society, we can better prepare not just our communities and our businesses and our homeowners, but also the built environment as well. So let's recap then back to February of this year. As I've already mentioned, we were pummeled by Kira, Dennis, and Jorge within very quick succession, and it resulted in intense and widespread flooding across the UK. And as the image there shows, it did exceed long-term rainfall averages. Estimates put it at 4,000 to 5,000 properties to have flooded across the UK. And what was interesting this time was the level of flooding that we saw. Two photos there, particularly on the River Severn. The one on the left is in Ironbridge in Shropshire, where the temporary barriers actually buckled. They didn't overtop in Ironbridge, but they certainly buckled under the pressure. And then the photo on the right is in Bewdley, just slightly further downstream, where indeed they did overtop. And I've put here that this flooding was lived through the pre-pandemic lens. It was in February. It was before lockdown started, and so moving into the first phase of recovery, that immediate aftermath, the days, the weeks immediately after Dennis and Kira and Jorge. Recovery started as it always would for many of these people, engaging with their insurance company, engaging with loss adjusters, possibly some conversations with their local authorities. But very quickly, as we know, lockdown kicked in mid-March, and this compounded the impacts for many. It brought added complications, additional stresses. The lucky ones actually did manage to start the drying process with dehumidifiers, and were able to find temporary accommodation nearby. But many were less lucky, and as I've mentioned, even now there are many houses that are largely untouched since the flood. And being out on the ground as I was at the end of last week, and indeed on Monday of this week, it really does bring home the pressures that it brought to family groups. Indeed, you think about the complications and the stresses and anxieties that we've all been through in the last 6 months in terms of concerns for health, homeschooling, lots of these pressures. That was compounded for many in terms of flood recovery. And so, as I've mentioned, human aspects and mental health really came to the fore, and many local authorities themselves were struggling to respond, process grant application claims. I was talking to an individual from a local authority a couple of weeks ago, and he was telling me that he was diverted from his normal flood risk and engineering remit and responsibility into a role supporting the local authority at the nearby Nightingale Hospital, preparing briefing packs for local funeral directors and undertakers, and that was a month that was needed. It was obviously a very intense period for them, but it just meant that day jobs got suspended. So inevitably, the recovery and the support that local authorities give post flood to flood victims was affected. Despite that, there's some really good examples of providing practical and emotional support. Shropshire Council being just one, they set up a virtual Zoom information trailer with the National Flood Forum. Normally they would be out on the ground with the little trailer that you see in the bottom right. Actually, they did it this time on Zoom, and that was just one example of many across the country. So there were innovations found in terms of supporting affected communities, but COVID did introduce a new way of thinking, a new world, and just as an aside, I think this would make a really fascinating research MSc or undergraduate research topic. So if there's anyone out there that's interested in looking at how the effects of COVID, what the effects of COVID had on flood recovery this year, then please do get in touch with me. I'd be fascinated to see that. But it wasn't just February 2000. The flood events that we've seen span a decade or more, and these again are just some communities. But I could sit here and talk for 30 minutes just listing out communities that have been affected in the last decade or so. But last year we had flooding in Worcestershire and Evesham. We saw the breach of the flood bank in Wainfleet and a large-scale evacuation there, and indeed the incident at Toddbrook Reservoir at Whalley Bridge. A few years ago now, over winter 15-16, storms Dennis, Eva and Frank brought large-scale flooding and disruption to the north of England, so Yorkshire, Cumbria, Carlisle, Cockermouth, and indeed into Scotland as well. Estimated that winter about 5,000 properties were flooded by Desmond alone. And again, let's not gloss over those numbers. That's 5,000 individual family stories and individuals that have had to get their lives back together. The year before that, or 2 years before that, we had the flooding down on the Somerset Levels, the southwest coast, the Thames Valley. That was the year when the Dawlish rail line became undermined and suspended, and severing links to the southwest. And sort of rewinding then the clock back to summer 2007, July 2007, we saw major UK-wide flooding. And I'm just going to touch now on some of these more recent events. Toddbrook last year, we can all remember this one. The enormous multi-agency response that it demanded, and actually a very quick and swift evacuation of Whalley Bridge downstream. I think the first report came in at something like 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and by 4 o'clock, the evacuation was well underway. So it really was a very impressive multi-agency response there. An independent review was concluded earlier this year, and it's important to note that right at the start of that review, it does acknowledge that the UK has an excellent safety record in terms of reservoir management, and we continue to maintain safety and standards around reservoirs. But it does identify a series of recommendations that can now be taken forward by the appropriate authorities. But I mentioned 2007, and in many ways it was a turning point for flood risk management across the UK. There was widespread flooding throughout June and July. Sadly, 13 people lost their lives, and we had 55,000 homes and businesses flooded. And you can see the stats there. You know, best part of 50,000 homes without power for days. With very nearly had to evacuate, I think, Cheltenham and Gloucester. Bowsers were on the streets because of water supply issues. And it actually has its own Wikipedia page, and you can go and look up the stats. But it does say that it was the largest civil response post the end of the Second World War in the UK. And so it was a major flood, which helped to shine a light on where improvements were needed in response, resilience, preparedness. And so you'll probably all be familiar with this, but the government initiated the independent review by Sir Michael Pitt, which resulted in 92 recommendations, and some of them are on the screen there. But the one I just want to touch on, which will then lead us into the next set of slides, is the creation of a portfolio of flood protection measures. Now, traditionally, we use this hierarchy, I suppose, to indicate where people might benefit, and it's the lucky ones at the top who perhaps benefit from traditional flood defence schemes if, on a cost and benefit ratio perspective, their community is eligible and able to demonstrate cost effectiveness. But for the vast majority, it is therefore sandbags or do nothing, sadly. And post Pitt, that became unacceptable, and there was a recommendation for more measures to be introduced. So that then sparked innovation in the industry, and sadly, many will continue to make do in the absence of anything else. We've seen sandbags, boards, wheelie bins. People will do whatever they need. Sandbags, compost bags, whatever they need. And again, we can do better. We can do better than sandbags, and we must do better. And in fact, if you now look on the Environment Agency's website for sandbags, it actually, as of the 16th of June this year, it says that sandbags are no longer recommended, but instead it's recommended you install property flood resilience products at your property in advance of flooding. So there has been a move, there has been a shift, and as a result, we've seen temporary flood barriers, as we've seen in Ironbridge and Bewdley, already mentioned, and the introduction and the innovation of property level protection, property flood resilience type measures, barriers, doorways, pumps, gates, self-closing air bricks, non-return valves, products that can be installed at property scale to help provide peace of mind, reduce damage, and hopefully long-term betterment on insurance as well. So here's just a sample of some PFR measures, and I know Kirsty will follow up and talk a little bit more about PFR. But fundamentally, language is key here. The intention of property flood resilience is not to make the house entirely watertight. It would be great if we could, but water will always seep and find a way. So it's about acknowledging and explaining to people that we can't really stop or prevent it entirely, but it's about managing expectations. And if the vast majority of water can be kept out, you can get back on your feet quicker. Yeah, you may have to mop up with a tea towel, an odd puddle, but if you then haven't got the anxiety and the stress of moving out with your family into temporary accommodation, an enormous £80,000 insurance claim, and indeed all the stress then of recovery and getting your property back together, then that's an achievement. So tools like PFR and indeed personal flood plans can help people on this journey towards resilience and preparedness. Pleasingly, we now have an emerging code of practice to help guide and govern PFR, not just in terms of the initial flood risk assessment survey, which identifies what properties are going to benefit from, but also in terms of the supply and installation of measures. The industry has been around for about 10 years, and sadly in that time some product suppliers have come and gone, and the industry has moved from a period of infancy to a greater level of maturity, which is pleasing to see, and things like the code of practice are really important steps for the industry. So it does work. There's some great examples of PFR in action, and indeed it includes boundary walls as well. So bottom right there, we can see they have a garden wall on their patio. They've been able to keep most of it out. A gate in the opening, and look what looks like a sump pump behind the wall there to collect any drainage and pump it back out over the wall. Okay, so the question then, the challenge I see is how do we mainstream this? Because you go back to that hierarchy, and PFR has the potential to provide betterment and benefit to more people than traditional flood defence schemes. So how do we mainstream it? How do we take it from this period of infancy that it was to normalised? And so there have been a growing range of initiatives and indeed funding to encourage take up and awareness of PFR across England and Scotland. There are currently 3 DEFRA funded Pathfinder schemes that are being delivered in England to promote and raise awareness. There's one in Devon and Cornwall, there's one in the Oxford Cambridge area, and there's one across Yorkshire. So they will deliver on different initiatives in terms of demonstration facilities, new websites, social media, exhibition trailer tours, work with education as well. There is indeed now a national PFR framework that was initiated about 18 months ago by the Environment Agency, but it's actually open and available to all UK risk management authorities and the Scottish Government. So that's intended to promote easier procurement and access to specialist suppliers and manufacturers. With a particular spotlight then on Scotland, there has been a baselining report undertaken by Climate Exchange in the last year, which identified that about 1,500 properties currently benefit, but actually about a third of all properties at risk in Scotland could benefit. So the question is, how do we deliver that, and how do we overcome and understand the barriers to uptake? Because locally there will be reasons perhaps why PFR is challenged or perhaps not the preferred solution. Insurance then plays a massive part here. It is in many ways the hook, but pleasingly and from a really important perspective, there have been 2 major steps forward over the last couple of months. Firstly, with the National Flood and Coastal Risk Management Statement that was presented in front of Westminster Parliament last month, and it says, subject to consultation, changes will allow for insurance claims to include an additional amount so that flood resilience measures are included in the repairs and allow households that have property flood resilience measures in place to benefit from lower premiums. And that was echoed also in the Flood Re annual statement as well. So there's a move then by insurers to encourage PFR measures such as barriers and pumps and air bricks and non-return valves to be put in place, and for this to then be reflected in people's premiums. So we need to set standards. We need to make sure that the homeowners and the insurance industry have assurance that it's not a case of picking up the yellow pages and finding a local Bob the Builder who doesn't have any awareness of flood risk. But it's about ultimately then providing an accreditation so that independent assessors, manufacturers and installers are all working to the same standards. We need to see suppliers who embrace the BSI kite mark. And in doing that, there are parallels with other industries, such as gas safe. And I pose the question then, that year on year, insurers would want to see that the measures provided are still fit for purpose. So there needs to be an annual MOT. There needs to be some form of annual audit that is affordable to homeowners. So the challenges then are many. And as I've mentioned, COVID-19 does introduce a new landscape for us. And I think from experience, it's important that comms are effective and that we're able to take the public with us, because it is their homes and their communities and their businesses that are affected here. And there's an element of ownership and risk assessment, risk acceptance rather. So where we want to get to is where homeowners, businesses and communities who are flood ready. Forgive me, I took this from Twitter earlier in the year, but it's an interesting graphic, but it just, I think, highlights that many of our emergency planners recognise that actually it's climate change that long term presents the biggest hazard for them. So if we're going to mainstream flood resilience and preparedness and property flood resilience, how do we normalise it? How do we normalise a flood resilient mindset? And I'm going to very briefly conclude by drawing an analogy to fire risk. We've all been in hotels, shops, bars, restaurants, offices where we've seen the fire evacuation sign, and all public buildings legally are required to have a fire risk assessment and an emergency plan in place. And that's my son's fire engine. He's 2. He loves playing with it. The point I'm making is that in the 80s and 90s, the fire industry did a huge amount to raise awareness of preparedness and fire protection in the home and the workplace, and it's normalised it. It's normalised it. So from a very young age, people and children are taught it in schools. And I'm not for one moment suggesting my son should be pushing around a SEPA or EA wagon with temporary flood barriers on it. That's not what I'm suggesting. But what I am saying is that we can draw analogies from the effectiveness of what the fire industry have done in terms of the message. And so I ask the question then, of those 5 million people that live or work at flood risk, and of those 1 in 6 properties that are at risk of flooding, how many have actually got flood evacuation plans in place? How many buildings have you ever been in where the access and egress route is mapped on the back of the door? How many buildings have you been in where there are emergency grab bags? How many buildings have you been in where you have seen flood barriers or pumps or air bricks? Okay, so as you can see, I think we've got a long way to go here. So we need to mainstream the conversation, promotion and raising awareness. Yes, there are barriers that we need to overcome, but practitioners, responders, regulators, we have a duty to reach out to schools, communities, workplaces, businesses, to help normalise these conversations around flood preparedness and resilience. And initiatives such as 30 Days, 30 Ways are excellent at doing that. So from me then, 2 final thoughts, really. So despite its potential and promise, property flood resilience is yet really to fully realise its potential. And there's a big element here of risk perception and behavioural change. There has been a lack of penetration, really, and probably a lack of awareness. But pleasingly now, insurers are starting to promote Build Back Better. So we need to encourage the public to accept that actually future flooding, repeated flooding, is part of what we all need to live with, and everyone has a responsibility to take some action to help limit the impacts and the effects. But terminology then is where I want to close. Should we be talking about lessons learned, or should we be talking about improvement? I'm not going to get into the semantics of it all, but importantly, when we engage with the public, we need to be using clear and appropriate terminology. PFR, I've used that term plenty of times in the last 30 minutes. I've explained it, and as professionals, we will be familiar with it. These terms such as resistance and resilience and recoverability. But let's not stand on someone's doorstep and start talking to them about recoverability. It's very simple. The message needs to be, try and keep it out and stay safe. Or it is a case of letting it in, or indeed letting some in and accepting some may come in, but actually recovering quicker. Keep it simple. And actually that then facilitates building back better and bouncing forward. So that is my contact details there. Please do get in touch with me afterwards if you have any questions offline. But I'm now delighted to say that our second speaker, Kirsty McRae, will take over. Kirsty McRae has worked for the Scottish Flood Forum for 7 years and is currently coordinating the PFR delivery group Living with Water. So Kirsty, over to you.
Hi all. I'm having real internet problems, so I've just said to Andy, who is.
I've just caught up on the text, everyone. Sorry about that. Yeah, I've seen that Kirsty is struggling with technology, but it looks like Kirsty, your slides are now up. So let's see if we can progress with you. But if not, we'll jump down to Petra if we still have connection issues.
So do you, sorry, do you want me to carry on or?
Please, Petra. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Right. My take on building resilient communities is slightly broader. Sorry about the frog. So what we're very much about is working with communities, all communities, in across Scotland and beyond. And it's really very much around a place-based approach. So PASS is an organization that is volunteer-led. We have 400 volunteers. Can I go to the next slide, please? Am I moving the slide? Yeah. Here we are. So we have 400 volunteers, and they're mainly built environment professionals, planning professionals, transport engineers, and also architects. So we are a volunteer-led organization, as I said. We're impartial and independent. We have a free advice service that communities and individuals can call upon if they have some issues around planning or want to get more involved in it. So we have, like I mentioned, we have free advice service, but we also do skills training, especially around community councils, elected members and community groups around engagement, how to engage wider with the community, not just a few, but more. And I think that's probably the theme for my discussion today, because I do think it's very, very important that when we are talking about resilient communities, we fully understand what and how communities work and how they can work better together. So our decision-making process has to be open and inclusive. And of course, now with the new Planning Act in Scotland 2019, we also have for the first time local place plans, which are place plans designed by the community and with the community, and they can affect all sorts of issues, from how do we deal with derelict and vacant land, how do we perhaps look at shoring up efforts in building community resilience. But all of this is bottom up, and it's enshrined in the Act that communities themselves are in the driving seat. Of course, when we talk about resilience, I think we also need to talk about place, work, folk. So it's not just about a place, it's also how we go about, and of course, what we do in a place as well. So for us, town planning is not just place planning, it's really the importance of folk planning, which of course is Sir Patrick Geddes, who is often coined as the father of town planning. One of the issues that we're finding is that we've got very important times in terms of we're just having experienced a pandemic, and of course that has driven a very different notion around place. We're just starting a blog where we have contribution from different European countries to see how the pandemic struck there and how people reacted in their places. So we know, for example, from anecdotal evidence that certainly we felt that there has been a drop in pollution. We felt there was a different way of experienced modes of transport, and all of these are quite interesting to look back once we are going through this. But again, it's very, very important about the impact on well-being, physical and mental health. But we're also seeing an exacerbating of existing inequalities, and it's not just health inequalities, but it's also economic inequalities. So we're currently working with communities who have been very much impacted by the pandemic in terms of the decision-making process, such as community councils. For those of you who know, community council are the statutory consultees in the planning system. If they can't meet, and many of them haven't met for like 5 months now, if they can't meet, then that decision-making process is severely impacted. So I think the pandemic has shifted to a greater understanding how what resilience actually means. So when we talk about with communities, when we're working with communities, we really need to be aware that no two communities experience the same place. And again, as I mentioned before, COVID-19 is showing that. It's also that when we had recent roundtable discussions or webinars across Scotland with different communities in different communities experiencing it very differently. So if we're talking to Highland and Island communities compared to contrasting that with communities from Glasgow or Edinburgh, they're very, very different divergence coming forward. And I think we need to be really aware of that, because obviously resilience is also to do with stress. And if a community is stressed, it cannot be taking in the information as well as some other communities might do. So we need to have connection. And one of the areas that I'm particularly keen on with regards to climate change and flooding is actually resilience has to come from a societal point of view. We must ensure that our communities are empowered, and displacement that will happen more and more through climate change will mean that some parts of the world will experience climate change in a different way and will probably flee some of the consequences of that. Are we ready for that? I don't think we are currently discussing enough how we can build our society that is ready and able to take in climate change refugees. So if we are we need to know who we are as a community. We need to understand how we can connect with each other and with each other's broader understanding of place. And for me, the place standard tool is one of the very excellent tools to start a conversation about place in the widest sense. I mentioned already the Planning Act in Scotland, which has enormous opportunities for climate change and resilience. I should say one of the duties that are now included in the Act is also to involve young people and children in a discussion around place. That is a very progressive move, and for me, I feel young people especially understand the connection between place and climate change, and are really eager to get involved. We're currently starting on the 1st of September, working with young people to discuss NPF4 and climate change. How does the National Planning Framework for and climate change, how can National Planning Framework accommodate some of the measures that have to be taken into account? So I mentioned all of the new aspects of the plan. Again, it's important that we're not seeing the local place plan in isolation, but it's a cascading up of responsibilities from local people. And I think that's a very good starting point, perhaps, for some of the technological measures that we need to have in terms of addressing with flooding and climate change, making people more aware of that. Here we are, the local place plan. I have said that that's what a community has to do, and I think it fits very well with some of the PFR, perhaps, that was talked about earlier. And it's to be reviewed every 7 years, but it can be, of course, more frequently. So there's a new opportunity for local place plan to play a part, and an opportunity to support resilience. And I think if local communities plan for their local area, then of course flooding and climate change will play a part in this and will have to be addressed. So that's a very quick gallop through, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Petra. Thank you. And I wrote down a couple of sound bites from your talk. It was very fascinating. But early on, you said the importance of putting communities in the driving seat, and I couldn't agree with you more on that point. But also this question that you posed about, are we already seeing a gap between the more resilient communities and less resilient communities? And again, with the COVID pandemic, we've shone a torch through that, I think. So really fascinating talk, and no doubt there'll be some questions that will be posed in the text chat that we can pick up on a little later. Reading about Kirsty's problems with her connection, Kirsty has apologised and will record her session later, I now understand, with Andy offline. So we're going to just change the order and timing slightly, and now move over to Shruti for the next 30 minutes. Shruti Jain is Health Improvement Manager at Public Health Scotland, and I think, Shruti, you're going to talk about the role of the place standard in developing resilient communities for us. So over to you. Thank you.
In this presentation, I'm going to be presenting on behalf of SNIFR as well as Public Health Scotland. Unfortunately, my colleague Ruth can't be with us today due to a severe family illness, but the reason for our collaborative approach is just to outline our shared interests and the value of the place standard in our work. Now, before I move on, I've actually been having a few Wi-Fi issues myself yesterday afternoon and today. Today's been okay, it's not been too bad, so I'm just going to switch my video off. But you should, so I'll do that now, and you should still be able to hear me. So can people still hear me? Someone can just let me know.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Shruti.
Excellent, excellent. So just over the next 30 minutes, I'll present first from SNIFR's perspective on the challenge of a changing climate and the implications for health and well-being. And then I'll touch on the needs in relation to creating resilient communities, and then I'll make the case for the value of a place-based approach and the role of the place standard tool. Just before I start, just a few words about Public Health Scotland. So that's where I work, and I'm Health Improvement Manager there. It's a newly formed organisation as part of the wider Public Health Reform Programme in Scotland. And it brings together the key functions of public health. So that's public health improvement, health protection and healthcare public health. Our vision is of a Scotland where everybody thrives, with a focus on increasing healthy life expectancy and reducing premature mortality. So together we are jointly accountable to the Scottish Government and COSLA. And COSLA is a body that groups the local authorities in Scotland together. And we will have our first 3-year strategy at the end of this year. So kind of alongside public health reform, which has been happening over the last couple of years. In June 2018, the Scottish Government and COSLA agreed 6 public health priorities, and they're shown on the slide there. And you can see that place is right up there as a priority. And the priority reads as a vision for places, Scotland, where we live in a vibrant, healthy and safe places and communities. And for our work within Public Health Scotland, falling underneath these priorities, all our actions will be structured around the 14 themes in the place standard. So I'll be talking a little bit more about those a little bit later. But just to say that these public health priorities for Scotland link to our national performance framework and to the Sustainable Development Goals as well. So just moving on to SNIFR. SNIFR is a charity with a focus on increasing resilience in the face of environmental change. And it has many ways of doing this, but in particular, it builds capacity of organisations, communities and businesses. It catalyses place-based partnerships at a range of scales, from localities right up to the city region level. It also delivers the Adaptation Scotland programme and forms the Secretariat for the Climate Ready Clyde. So SNIFR and the team there have been working with the place standard team to look at using the place standard tool. So we just wanted to, I suppose, highlight the risk that's out there, as Phil has done in his presentation, just on climate change. So we know that our climate is already changing, and this is a result of historic and ongoing emissions. There's been recent storms, and this has derailed our fragility. So efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions may limit the extent of future climate change, but they cannot prevent significant changes from occurring. We can expect increased temperatures and increased heat waves, a rise in sea levels, changes to rainfall patterns with increased storms and flooding. And all of this will impact on our infrastructure, buildings and supply chains, our ecosystems, and the health and well-being of our society. We can also expect impacts on air quality and new infections, as well as food safety. So this will all impact on people's health well-being in a number of ways, for example, through heat exhaustion, respiratory illnesses, injuries, infectious diseases, and even death, as well as psychological impact from flooding. Climate change is a stress multiplier, exacerbating existing health problems and having differential health impacts on different groups of people. So it's more likely that disadvantaged groups are affected by climate change in three main ways. They're going to experience greater exposure to climate threats, increasing their susceptibility to damage caused by these threats and their ability to cope with and recover from the damage. And as Petra has outlined, this equality will be further exacerbated by COVID-19, which is a social pandemic within a viral pandemic, as well as with climate impacts not affecting all communities equally. So planning a green recovery from COVID-19 provides an opportunity to build back better to create resilient communities. To do so, it will be important to integrate climate, place, inequalities and well-being. And what we need to do to adapt to climate change is also good for health, well-being and equality. For example, by providing better housing for any weather, nature-based solutions and stronger community connections, we create resilient communities. Whilst there are many definitions of resilient communities, this definition from Joseph Rowntree Foundation emphasises the point about recovering better from it. And I'll just leave that on the side there for a minute for you to read. To build community resilience, we recognise that there are a number of challenges and needs. Firstly, approaches need to be relevant to communities. Climate change is not a standalone issue, and adapting to a changing climate means we need to embed climate preparedness within broader systems. Secondly, we need to build resilience in ways that are fair and address not only the climate impacts themselves, but also the underlying social and economic issues at play. And thirdly, we need a robust process. Communities may not know how to influence decisions that affect them or know how to take action in relation to climate change. So it is important to build the capacity and provide opportunities for communities and organisations to work together, to share ideas, to take decisions, deliver actions that take climate change into consideration. So SNIFR has found that this is a really effective way of addressing these needs, is to take a place-based approach to building community resilience. So what is place? There are, of course, many definitions of place as well, but in Scotland we use the Creating Places definition from the 2013 Scottish Government Policy Statement on Architecture and Place. And what this definition says is that place is made up of many different elements. It includes the physical environment, such as buildings, streets or green spaces, and also social aspects, such as the people and how they feel about the place where they live. So place is complex and interlinked, and a place cannot just be physical or social. It needs to be both elements. It needs to be all of those elements. And because of this, every place is unique. The quality of life that comes from the interaction. So place is basically, and it creates the quality of life that comes from the interaction of people and their surroundings. Creating Places also states that placemaking is the collaborative and creative process of design, development and regeneration to ensure that places are sustainable, well-designed and meets the needs of these communities. So that's the 2013 Scottish Government Policy Statement on Architecture and Place. So why is place important? Any development always makes places. The question is whether they contribute positively, have little impact or lead to negative outcomes. So there are a number of factors that come together in a place to affect health and well-being. And these are captured in the Place Standard tool, and there are some listed here on this slide. So places to meet people, access to job opportunities, contact with nature, feeling safe and suitable accommodation are some factors that make a good place. But issues such as noise, isolation, poorly maintained spaces, lots of traffic, feeling unsafe, poor air quality and consistent flooding can have a profound effect on people. It can lead to poor mental health, poor physical health, and increased levels of hormones associated with stress, which can bring about the onset of long-term health conditions and illnesses. Okay, so I did have another slide in here, which is not on this one, so I'll just talk about it, but and I'll make sure the slide gets across to a revised presentation to Andy so it can be circulated after the webinar today. But what I was going to talk about is just a model from NHS Health Scotland, which illustrates the patterns of health and health inequalities. And what the place standard tries to do is focuses on the wider environmental influences and the individual experiences within those environments. So how people use the space and what do they have access to. And the place standard gathers individual and the collective experience to inform and influence change in the wider environment for improved health and well-being. As a framework and a methodology for a place-based approach, it affects to rebalance the unequal distribution of income and power. So by empowering individuals and communities to gain control over environments that shape their lives, this is a fundamental driver of good health and well-being. So the principle behind the place standard is that the local people are the experts. They know what it's like to live in the place, and they know what is in the place, and they know how they use the place and other people use the place. So in the early days of its development, colleagues realised that professionals had been doing things to people for a very long time. So the tool is about changing that thought process and doing things with people rather than to them. And very early on in its design, there was a series of questions. And one of the main questions was, are we having the right conversations with the right people at the right time to change things for the better? So the Scottish Government and COSLA agreed to adopt the place principle, which seeks to help overcome organisational and sectoral boundaries to encourage better collaboration and community involvement and improve the impact of combined energy resources and investment. It promotes a wide and shared understanding of place across Scotland and the need to take a more collaborative approach to a place's services and assets to achieve better outcomes for people and communities. So what you can see here on the slide is taken directly from the place principle itself, and it recognises and encourages local flexibility to respond to issues and circumstances in different places. So just moving on to the tool. So in addition to the place principle that we have here in Scotland, the place standard tool provides a framework for a comprehensive conversation around place between all stakeholders with outputs that can shape priority to collaborative working. So the place standard tool is a key enabler to place-based working and thus applying to the place principle. It was jointly built by Public Health Scotland, the Scottish Government, Architecture and Design Scotland and Glasgow City Council, launched in December 2015, and in 2017 won an RTPI Planning for Excellence award. So the place standard tool is about creating high quality places in Scotland. It's about maximising the potential of elements of place and the social environment, bringing them together to support health and well-being and create a healthy quality of life for everybody. It recognises that local people are the experts and puts people at the heart of any planning process. So how does it work? The data generated helps to identify the main issues for improvement in the place. It can also help to find out what people think and feel about their place and help to identify the strengths of an area. It helps people to identify and start the process of action planning, ultimately leads to better places for everyone and improved health and well-being. It's built around 14 themes, and these themes cover a broad range of the physical and the social characteristics that make up a good place. The themes help people to think about practical things that they need from a place. For example, shops, access to healthy food, doctors' surgeries or schools, as well as how they feel about a place. So for example, whether they feel part of a community or if they feel that their views are important to the area. So all of the 14 themes are connected and sometimes appear to cross over, and this reflects the complex nature of places and the wide range of factors that impact them. And this can help people to think broadly about their area or place rather than getting stuck on one thing that they think is positive or negative. And it also helps and encourages a wide range of stakeholders to work together to successfully improve highlighted areas of concern. So for each of the 14 themes, there is a key headline question and a series of think around prompts. prompt questions, and the headline question must be answered for each of the 14 themes, and it's scored, and each theme is then scored. So as I said, each theme is given a score from 1 to 7, and where 1 is it's not doing very well and there's room for improvement, and 7 means there's a lot of room. So I've said that round. It means there's little room for improvement, and the place is of pretty good quality. The 14 scores are then taken and plotted onto the compass diagram, and this is a kind of a key feature of the place standard tool. And the dots are then joined, and you can see this on the slide that I've got here. So the scores are then gathered for each of the themes, and they quickly show where people have identified strengths and issues. However, this is just one part of the tool and one part of the assessment process. The feedback gathered during the discussion is the real outcome from the tool. So the conversations are the most important part of the place standard tool, as the comments explain people's real experience of the place and living there. And the comments should be examined and used to inform any action plans that are made. So this way, the tool treats that local people are the experts and gives everyone an opportunity to have a say. It makes no assumptions around what should or could be done to improve the place. So what you can see on the slide there is an example of how one assessment has been presented after it's happened. So you've got the scores that have been captured, and they've been plotted onto the compass diagram, which is shown in the middle, and then the comments, the key comments that have been agreed from the conversations under each of those 14 themes that fall behind the scores and provide the details have been kind of captured and kind of displayed on this A3 page. And it's a really lovely way of kind of providing a really full picture of the conversation and the assessment that's taken place. So everyone's comments and scores are then compiled and analysed to understand what the majority of people think. And what this helps us do is to identify specific areas or issues that need to be improved, or indeed where there are strengths and issues that people, or areas that people particularly like. And it's these results that can be used to start a discussion around how, when, and who will make these improvements and maintain the areas that people do like. So in this example that's shown in this slide, the main issues for improvement, and this is based on the scores and the comments gathered together, are identified as influence and sense of control, housing, and play and recreation. So the comments have helped to identify the detail, and they've also started to highlight some of the actions that can be taken place to make improvements in the local area, and this is directly from people who live in those areas. I think it's important to highlight that different locations will have different graph shapes. So if you live in a coastal area, that'll be very different to an assessment that's taken place in a rural area or in a city centre. But there can also be different groups in one place that will produce different graphs as well. And this is obviously alongside the different comments. And I think this example from South Queensferry illustrates this really well. So there were 3 sets of responses gathered through kind of the late end of summer, beginning of autumn in 2015 from the public and then from school children. And the assessment took place in South Queensferry, which is just kind of lies adjacent to Edinburgh and next to the sea. And if you look at the theme, which focuses on moving around, which is the one that is at 12 o'clock on the compass, you can see that there's a huge variance when the graph is displayed this way. So when the scores from those 3 assessments taken on those 3 separate occasions is displayed on the diagram, and it shows that there are different views between the different groups, and if you look into the detail behind those comments and who provided those comments, you can begin to unpick that actually it's really great. It's a great place to live if you're a commuter, because you're most likely to commute into Edinburgh, and there's this kind of infrastructure there provided for you. But if you're a school child, it's really difficult to travel around that local area and get to school, and that provision's not been made. So the assessments can highlight really important issues for different groups in the community. And as I said, just to reiterate that point, that the place standard assessment is so much more than the 1-7 scoring system, and kind of marking those onto the tool itself. It's about the comments and the detail in those comments. So once you've kind of gone through the process of having a discussion, and you've begun to map some of the issues out, and you've reached an agreement around the main issues for improvement in your place, you can use the results to get started on developing actions. And there are 2 further stages in the tool called review and next steps, which help you to kind of interpret the responses, but also begin to take action to address what's been learned. And that kind of completes the place standard process. So I think it's really important to remember that the place standard assessment is part of a process, and it's not the end of a process. And you're probably most likely to need to have another conversation or another workshop where the work is kind of examined and reflected on to begin to unpick some of those actions, and the action plan is actually developed. So, but when you're considering what you might do afterwards, you should really think about how you can build on the conversations and relationships that have started from using the tool. So I'm just going to check I've got enough time. So, yep, the place standard can be used at any time. So it can be used at early stages of development, such as designing a new housing estate or drawing an area's development. But it can also be used to monitor and review the progress of an existing area, as the framework will be consistent and comparable over time. A good example of when the place standard can be used is when it's time to create a plan of improvement for the area. And whilst there is responsibility in Scotland for community planning partnerships to create local outcomes improvement plans and locality action plans, community members can start their own action planning process to inform the work of these plans, particularly now as a result of the introduction of place plans. So it's a really good tool. I think, as Petra highlighted, that the introduction of the place plans, but also the opportunity to use the place standard tool to inform the development of some of those place plans. So the place standard has been used like really successfully across Scotland and elsewhere, and we've got a number of case studies that have been written up and that are available online. And I have a note of those at the end of this presentation that you can go to. So just to say really quickly that in Scotland there have been 142 applications with a reach of at least 16,000 people. And that's across Scottish local authorities and both of the national parks. And that was based on 28 area returns in November 2018. So that's not all the figures. That's obviously the figures from since November 2018. So that number will have increased. And the graph, the pie chart on this slide shows how it's broadly been used to inform the LOIPs, the local development plans, master plans, and so on. So as well as being applied across all of Scotland, there's also 3 big projects in England, including one in Carlisle that is using the place standard tool. Belfast are also up and trained using the tool. And then we are aware that there's been international translations and application in a number of countries, including Lithuania, Turkey, the Netherlands, Cyprus, Greece, Norway, Germany, Spain, Switzerland, and there's so many more countries that I can't list because I would be here forever. But we've also had recent interest in application in the Gambia and the Western Pacific WHO region as well. So just a note on impact, we wouldn't expect to witness some of the significant physical change in communities within 4 years of the launch of the tool. But as the pie chart shows, we have witnessed significant embedding in inclusive in some of the plans and processes that inform investment of public money. So if we trust these policies and plans and processes, then logic would suggest that improved places will be generated as a result of the tool being part of that process. And we'll be doing some work, hopefully, over the next year. It was meant to start this year, but all our work's been slowed down because of COVID. So we've not got as much capacity as we used to at Public Health Scotland because people are working on COVID now. But we were going to start looking at kind of beginning to capture some of the impact of the use of the place standard tool in communities. And that's something that I think, all being well with COVID, that we should be able to crack on with in the next year or so. So at the national level, we've been doing a lot of work on the place standard tool, and we actually, over the last 18 months, have been working to produce an updated and revised version of the tool, and that's the big project that I've been leading on. And this was just as part of our commitment to continuous improvement, but also based on some anecdotal feedback that we'd received in its early days of its use. So very early on, climate change was identified as a key missing theme. So what we've been doing is working very closely with colleagues who work in climate adaptation and mitigation to strengthen the tool, support local conversations on place and climate change. So we know that engagement at all levels will be vital to ensure communities, businesses and individuals are active participants and essential if we're to succeed in delivering our nation's commitment on climate change targets. And the Place Standard tool offers a clear and inclusive and proven route to engagement and should be an important part of this proactive dialogue. So engagement has a key role to inform individuals about the role that they have to play in changing their behaviour. So as a national team, we felt that there was no conversation that could continue to happen about place that wouldn't fully consider climate change and its impact. So we've done some significant amount of work to update the main version of the tool generally, but also in how it kind of incorporates climate change. And as well as considering climate change, we've also looked at COVID as well. So there's always been a large amount of the discussion on the themes as a result of the pandemic and the lockdown that are directly relevant to place standards, such as access to services, community resilience, access to recreation, and so on. So with the final draft of this second tool, it's the same tool, but an updated tool being prepared in June, this change in context was discussed and some small changes have been made. So just alongside our work to improve and strengthen the main tool, we've been developing additional resources which build on the tool, but with a climate lens. So in light of the emerging evidence and as national policies have developed around climate change, we can expect to see a wide range of policy interventions to address climate change. So our work here, so the tool with the climate lens, will further support the role of the Place Standard in enabling a place-based approach to climate adaptation and mitigation. So we also know that there are some sustainability and climate change teams across local authorities in Scotland who are seeking tools to engage communities in the development of their strategies. So for example, in 2016, South Lanarkshire adapted the Place Standard tool to engage with young people in the development of their sustainable development and climate change strategy. And they'll be going through that process again at the end of this year, and now any kind of consultation questions or tool they use would need to be much more climate related. So we hope that by producing a Place Standard with a climate lens, we'll be able to kind of not only support detailed conversations on climate at the place-based level, but we'll also be able to support the development of sustainable development and climate change strategies. So in the development of this tool, we undertook a small pilot last year with Perth and Kinross Council, who held 2 Place Standard events in Bankfoot and Methven. And flooding has been an issue in Bankfoot, and Perth and Kinross was a perfect opportunity given its long track record of engaging communities on adaptation. In addition to the 2 workshops, a briefing for facilitators was held to introduce a new resource. So the pilot highlighted the need for the facilitator to have a really strong knowledge of climate change adaptation measures to ensure that the discussion is focused and just a set of few focused questions. So what you can see on the slide here, it's very much in draft and it's very much in development, but this is an example of what kind of our colleagues at SNIFRA have been working on with us. But this is a detailed resource, which is essentially an adapted version of the main Place Standard tool. And it provides further guidance to help facilitators how and when to use the additional prompts to have the Place Standard conversation with a climate adaptation lens. So what this detailed resource will look like is basically on one side you'll have the main question sitting underneath one of the 14 themes with a series of prompt questions. And then on the right hand side you'll have an additional guidance which provides climate weather impacts under that particular theme, a little list of adaptation measures, and then a set of additional prompt questions relevant to that particular theme that any facilitator could use in a kind of conversation. So that would be quite a long document. It would end up being a 40-page document, but we've our pilot work has indicated that kind of guidance is needed. So in addition to that, we will also produce, and we have also produced, a shorter resource, which contains a small overview of climate change. So what are the risks, and why is it important that we talk about it now? And then just the additional prompt questions to consider under each of the 14 themes, and that currently sits at 2 pages long, so it's much more accessible. But at the time of the trial and the pilot, the resource was only focused on climate adaptation, but moving forward, we're going to be building in climate mitigation, and we'll continue to work with SNIFR and Sustainable Scotland Network to collaborate to progress to complete the resource. But we will be seeking to trial and test the new resources once they're developed, and anyone who's in the audience and is interested in helping us do this should kind of make contact with myself. So we've noted the need for detailed guidance for facilitators in order for them to be able to feel confident in hosting a conversation on climate change. So where possible, we will link to existing resources, as well as identifying examples and develop examples of where and how people have used place-based approaches, including using the place standard tool as one available methodology and taken action. And we will seek to make this available online. So all of this work that we're doing with SNIFR and with Sustainable Scotland Network. And I'm sure you can appreciate that some of this has been delayed because of capacity that's been taken onto COVID. So I just want to provide a few concluding thoughts here, is that just, kind of moving forward, we think it's really essential to take a place-based, inclusive and collaborative approach to recovery and future preparedness. A place-based approach can lead to sustainable and equitable outcomes. And there's a great opportunity to escalate and broaden the success of the place standard tool to support this ambition. It goes beyond typical engagement and promotes and encourages discussions around how people think and feel. The place standard puts people at the heart of any planning process. It supports everyone to work together and provides a well-recognised framework for dialogue around place. So hopefully the new improved tool, but also the climate-specific resources, will help to align climate change and health and inequality agendas at the local level. It'll allow people to share their views on climate change and how they want to respond to the climate emergency. It will help us identify how and if communities are prepared to take action in response to the climate emergency, and it will allow service providers to work collaboratively and with communities to achieve outcomes. And the last point I've raised there is, it's a question really. How can the place standard tool be used to link place, climate resource and green recovery? And this is a question because we don't really know. We're just kind of embarking on this work right now. But we do hope that the new resources and the supportive work will increase and support place-based action and identify and integrate adaptation and health and equity outcomes in the context of a green recovery. So, as I said, there's a couple of resources that I've popped on a slide here, so you can access the tool online. There's a really good learning resource that's designed for communities, but I think it's brilliant and that everyone should be looking at it and using it. And it provides an overview to the tool, but also how you can use the tool as well. And there's some case studies that are available both on YouTube, but also on one of our partners' websites. And there's also some relevant tools on Adaptation Scotland's website as well. So, and then just those are my contact details if you wish to contact myself about anything that I've raised here today. And Ruth, who couldn't be here today, has also provided her email should you want to contact her directly about anything. So thank you very much.
Shruti, thank you. That was an excellent and really interesting talk. And I'm sure plenty of questions will arise on the back of that. I've certainly got a few stored up for the Q&A session. So thank you for that. A little bit of housekeeping from me. Unfortunately, Kirsty from the Scottish Flood Forum has been unable to resolve her connection issues. So what will happen is that offline from this session today, Kirsty will record her presentation. And it will be disseminated with the slide pack and published as normal, so everyone can still see and hear the talk, but it will just be recorded offline at a later date. So fear not, you will all get to see the slides and hear the talk. What I would also encourage, we're a few speakers in now, I would really encourage everyone, please, to get involved on the chat on the right hand side, and please do interact with questions. I see we've got one question at the moment moment from Deborah. So thank you, Deborah, for that. But as we move into our final speaker, I'd really encourage everyone to start thinking about what you've seen, what you've heard, and raising some questions. We've had some really good speakers so far. So we're running ahead of schedule because of Kirsty not being able to join us today. So for the next sort of 20 minutes or so, we're going to move over to Branka. So Professor Branka Dimitrovic, who, as I said at the top, is Director of Research and Knowledge Exchange in the Department of Architecture at the University of Strathclyde. Branka is going to talk to us about community engagement and consultation and provide a case study. Then what we will do is move over to the Q&A session, which all speakers will be back on the panel. So we can take Q&A on the question chat. As I say, I've got a few already stored up, but please do get involved and type your questions in there. So Branka, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. Do you hear me? Thank you very much, Phil. Do you hear me now?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I think that it is really great that my talk will follow up what is currently going on with the improvement of Place Standard 2. Because I will present a case study of the interaction between researchers of 9 Scottish universities and a community group in Lithgow in Scotland that aimed to identify what that community wanted and needed to become more sustainable and resilient in response to climate change. That dialogue between the community group and the researchers revealed the importance of access to information on local resources that would enable better understanding of the capacities for their sustainable use and development, and how that need for information might be met. As a way of introduction, I will briefly describe global and local contexts that influence community engagement and actions for sustainable development. And then the talk will focus on community engagement for resilience in Lithgow, followed by the conclusions of the workshop on what the community needs to be able to make well-informed decisions, which is a local data portal, its key functions and initial contents. And finally, what the prospects might be. Within the global context, mitigation of climate change by reducing carbon emissions and efficient use of finite resources are high priorities. Architects and building services engineers address these requirements by proposing building design solutions that reduce the use of energy for maintaining a comfortable indoor environment and increase the use of low-carbon building materials and services. Along with the increased use of renewable materials and energy sources for construction and operation of buildings, the requirements for reducing carbon emissions and more efficient use of natural resources apply to infrastructure systems beyond buildings, within the surrounding built and natural environment. These new infrastructure systems encompass energy generation from renewables, energy storage and decentralized distribution, more efficient water and waste management, low carbon transport, and the use of information communication technologies for monitoring and managing infrastructure systems. One of the key influencers in setting the aims for the development of low-carbon economy was Jeremy Rifkin, an American economist, writer, political advisor, and activist. His vision of the way forward in addressing the global economic crisis, energy security, and climate change, as explained in his book, The Third Industrial Revolution, has been endorsed by the European Parliament in 2007, the UK government's white paper on energy in 2007, and United Nations Industrial Development Organization in 2011. Rifkin's vision of an industrial revolution includes 5 pillars that will reduce carbon emissions from energy generation and use first, renewable energy, second, buildings that contribute to energy generation from renewables, 3, energy storage, 4, ICT energy distribution systems, and 5, electric vehicles. It is envisaged as an infrastructure system that connects renewable natural resources with energy generation, storage, and ICT distribution systems, and transport powered by electricity. However, this is only a part of a much wider system of natural resources and man-made infrastructure systems that rely on them. As I will show later, the system's approach to establishing relationships between natural resources and infrastructure systems was used to initiate a dialogue with the community group in Lithgow. Rifkin's book, The Zero Marginal Cost Society, explores how the Internet of Things and collaborative commons might lead to a more democratic organization of social and economic life. The key elements and functions of the Internet of Things, or IoT, are presented in this diagram based on Rifkin's vision. Natural environment, people, consumption of goods and energy, machines, production lines, logistics networks, recycling flows, and other aspects of economic and social life could be linked via sensors to IoT platforms, continually feeding big data to every node, that is homes, vehicles, businesses, energy distribution centers, governance organizations, moment to moment, in real time, and in that way, better information on local and global natural resources and the state of the environment could assist in more responsible decision-making about the use of natural resources and the impact of human activities on the nature. As infrastructure systems serve and affect whole communities, only well-informed communities can be truly empowered to contribute to the decision-making about low-carbon infrastructure systems that could be developed in their area. In the last 2 decades, there has been an evolution in Scottish government policies relating to public engagement in decision-making that affects communities. In 2007, public participation in decision-making and planning in Scotland was included in Planning Advice Note PAN 81 by indicating that the only type of community group with a formal role in the planning system is community councils, who are consulted on planning applications. Following the above support for public participation in planning, the Scottish Government developed a strategy for public engagement in Scotland's transition to low-carbon economy in 2010. The strategy outlines the Scottish Government principles of engagement with public that will be motivational and proactive, focusing on opportunities, supportive of partners, and of a range of approaches, because not everyone will choose the same route at the same time, aware that much of the engagement will be led and delivered by others. Importantly, it was highlighted that the Scottish Government cannot and would not wish to centralize engagement. As this strategy supports different forms of decentralized engagement, it offers the opportunities for developing innovative forms of public involvement in local communities. The Scottish Government's digital strategy, published in 2011, indicates that digital technology not only allows greater scope for people to do things themselves, but also to contribute opinions, access information, and interact with others. The most comprehensive act for empowering communities in Scotland is the Community Empowerment Scotland Bill 2014. It aims to make the most of the talents that exist in Scottish communities, deliver high quality and improving public services, and support strong local democracy and local decision-making through community empowerment, and enable communities to do things for themselves and have their voices heard in the planning and delivery of services through community engagement and participation. Since 2008, community activism aiming at more sustainable and resilient development of communities worldwide in the context of peak oil, rising carbon emissions, and climate change has been boosted by the concepts outlined in the Transition Handbook by Rob Hopkins. Hopkins suggested various ways in which communities can become more resilient, such as local generation of energy and food production, different organization of healthcare, use of local building materials, reduction and reuse of waste, and other activities that communities might initiate according to their social, economic, and environmental context. In Scotland, there are 16 transition groups. Transition Lynn-Lithgow, formerly called Lynn-Lithgow Climate Challenge, was formed in 2008. The Transition Lynn-Lithgow website provides information on a range of activities that have been initiated to create a more sustainable community. As mentioned, a systems approach was used as a method for initiating a dialogue with the community group in Lynn-Lithgow about local renewable resources and related low-carbon infrastructure systems that might be developed. By using a systems approach, it should be possible to identify how the interaction between different infrastructure systems can increase the performance of each one and enable a more comprehensive and effective planning of low-carbon infrastructure systems. This approach was proposed within a collaborative project, Mainstreaming Innovation, that was undertaken by 9 Scottish universities in 2013-2014. The natural environment, which is land, waterways, biodiversity, is considered as a resource that is linked to technologies for improving energy efficiency of buildings and for energy generation from renewables, including storage and local distribution. It includes low-carbon transport infrastructures such as electric vehicles, cycling, walking, then water harvesting, saving and reuse, waste reduction, reuse, and to energy, and information communication technologies for linking, monitoring, and management of low-carbon infrastructure systems. A workshop on potential low-carbon infrastructure projects that could be developed in Lynn-Lithgow was organized by Transition Lynn-Lithgow and Mainstreaming Innovation in November 2013. 9 academics involved in mainstreaming innovation participated in the workshop, as well as 15 members of Transition Lynn-Lithgow. The next few slides show the workshop results presented in relation to each element of the proposed system. On the left side of the table, activities initiated and or suggested by Transition Lynn-Lithgow are listed, and on the right side, the general or additional suggestions of the academics who participated in the workshop. It can be noticed that the community group proposed potential future actions by naming projects that they already initiated or were planning. Regarding landscape and biodiversity, their focus was on local food production, one of key elements of resilience in times of unexpected interruptions of regular food supply. The community was using energy-saving advice and on how to improve energy efficiency of buildings and considering the refurbishment and the repurposing of an empty building in the high street. A very strong interest of the community in energy generation from renewables is evident by the number of different projects that they would like to initiate, including a feasibility study for district heating, possible locations for wind turbines, heat pumps from the local loch and canal, potential use of local biomass, and expansion of previous domestic solar projects. researchers suggested identifying heating demand of Lithgow and potential for meeting the demand with energy from renewables. Then street lighting powered by energy from renewables and energy storage solutions. They also suggested maintaining water quality in the loch and harvesting and reusing rainwater. Regarding water use and waste management, the community focused again on the potential for energy generation by capturing heat from the loch or canal for adjoining buildings, and through anaerobic digestion and CHP, combined heat and power, within each housing area. The community has already initiated actions for improving the means of low-carbon transport by improving routes for pedestrians and cyclists. Researchers suggested planning of charging points for electric vehicles powered by renewables. Regarding the use of IT for sharing information, Transitional Lithgow have a website which could be further developed to include information and tools required for decision-making about the optimal use of local resources and assets. The proposal for developing an information, decision-making, and community engagement portal for Lithgow was one of the ideas suggested at the workshop. The discussion focused on its aims and objectives and on a model that would provide key functions of interest to the community now, with the possibility for adding new functions as required in the future. The proposed framework of the Lithgow portal defines who the intended users are, who will provide data, the community objectives, desired outcomes, and local priorities. The Transitional Lithgow group provided a long list of desired outcomes of a local data portal. It clearly indicates the interests of the citizens of Lithgow and the areas about which they would like to be better informed and in which they would like to participate in decision-making. The list also shows that there is a need for developing local data portals for communities to enable access to information they need and enable well-informed participation in decision-making. The community also highlighted priorities that are aligned with the goals of the local authority. There was agreement that key functions of the portal should provide sharing and visualization of data required for decision-making on sustainable living and development. Then related decision-making tools and opportunities for citizens' interaction. As one of the listed objectives was data visualization, University of Alberta, Dundee, one of the partners in this project, developed a digital 3D model of Lithgow that provides an overview of Lithgow region, demonstrating the scope, scale, and topography. The 3D model of landscape can be augmented with custom data. The feasibility study on a district heating scheme in the center of Lithgow, undertaken by the University of Aberdeen, another partner in the project, included several maps with data on energy consumption with color coding related to the level of consumption. Dark red color indicates buildings with the highest annual energy consumption measured as kilowatt hours per square meter. This and other maps with information about the built environment can be integrated into 3D digital model and also made available on a local community portal. Data sharing and visualization enable better understanding of the local resources and opportunities. Decision-making tools will enable assessment of different intervention options. University of Alberta Dundee has developed such decision-making tools which can be integrated in the portal. The concept has been applied in sustainable urban and rural planning and water management. Various forms of citizens' interaction can be enabled within the portal and developed as required, such as continuous survey on the further portal development, other surveys as required, input of local knowledge on different topics, voicing opinions on specific issues, real-time information of interest to the community, and so on. So, what are the prospects? Identifying potential sources of funding for the development of the whole portal is the next step in making this idea a reality. The portal might provide a template for developing community engagement portals for other communities. Further development aim could be to integrate the virtual and the real world by giving any real thing an IP address and connecting it to an Internet of Things on the portal, and thus bringing it closer to the global trends in connecting the real world online by creating a digital twin of Linlithgow. A local data portal and digital twin of a settlement would enable citizens to access information on local natural resources and assets that can be used to plan more sustainable and resilient future for places. Thank you very much. That was my presentation and my contact details if you would like to find out more about this past project. Thank you.
Branka, thank you very much. Thank you. And I'll turn my webcam back on so that you can all see me. But thank you for another fascinating and really interesting talk. Taking really the dialogue on to consider through that Linlithgow example and case study that you've presented, to consider things like energy efficiency, like carbon, waste and water management. Some really pertinent points to take on. So as I mentioned, we are one speaker down, and as a result, we're sort of 20 minutes ahead of program. So we're now going to move into a Q&A session where all four of us speakers will make ourselves available. So we're all back now. And thank you to Deborah, firstly, for presenting. I can see 3 questions here that we can work through. I don't think Kirsty has been able to join us either for the Q&A, unfortunately. So it's just the 4 of us. So we'll work through these few questions, and I'd encourage anyone else that's on the line to add some questions as well. I can see a few more coming in. I've also got a few myself that we can dip to. So we'll start then with Deborah's first question, and it says. Sorry, let me find. There we go. As a volume house builder with an environmental science degree, I was always stunned when planning authorities zoned floodplains and flood vulnerable land for housing. Do the panel believe planning authorities have a better approach to land release now so many floods have occurred? So a few nods around the virtual panel, as it were. Petra, do you have a thought on that? I saw you nodding there.
Yes, I have. And I think one of the elements that we haven't touched on today is the e-planning that is coming forward. So as the planning system moves towards e-planning, it will capture a lot more data. And what we're finding is that, for example, flood risk areas will be identified. So too will be the kind of material that is being used in terms of building work. So I do think that planners are very much aware that they have an enormous role in terms of how to build in, shall we say, less risk areas and identifying new plans to do so. So I think we are living in a sort of transition right now where the planning system is going to be much, much more responsive and has already been asked to do so much more now.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I think not only our planners and our space makers, but also developers are increasingly now aware. They're using the strategic assessments that are in place by local authorities to at very early stages to inform their development plans. We're seeing more investment and innovation on sustainable drainage as well. So it's not just flood zones; it's also the development of sustainable drainage.
And can I just add on something else?
Yeah.
In another role, I'm the vice chair of Link Group, and we are now just seeking international accreditation, sustainability accreditation, because again, housing associations also have an important role to play in terms of energy efficiency and what kind of buildings we build for our communities, for our tenants.
Definitely, yeah. Did anyone else off the panel want to come in on that first question around floodplaning and development? No. Okay, we'll move on then. So Deb was posed us a second question, which this time links to. I'll read it out. I live on a farm and find local farmers' attitudes to wet ground is dig more drainage ditches, which solves their problem, but greatly increases runoff and flooding problems downstream. Is enough being done to educate farmers on the need for water catchment and to make it financially viable for them? So I suppose what we're talking about here then is the introduction of natural flood management techniques, working with natural processes more. I'm happy to take that one, but I'll open it up to the panel as well.
Just on that, I mean, I think the farming community is obviously is key in helping there, and we have working with Scottish Land Commission, but also RSPB and Environment Link are doing quite a lot. But again, this is probably also where Zero Waste Scotland could do a little bit more in terms of addressing some of the issues there around flooding.
Yeah, and I think the move that we've seen towards working with natural processes and natural flood management in the last 5 or 10 years has been really important. Like all flood risk management solutions, it's not the right solution in every location. So it's important that that is recognised. I think it's also important that it's recognised that clearly, if we have larger events coming through, then actually the benefit of NFM type measures may be reduced. I think it's probably more suited to smaller scale events, probably, unless we're talking about large scale upstream attenuation. But locally, to answer your question, Deborah, I think things like changing ploughing directions, for example, can just have a very simple impact, a very big impact rather, for a very simple preventative measure. Not only in terms of flood problems downstream and drainage, but you also mentioned runoff and siltation as well. So I think that's quite important. You mentioned in your question, Deborah, about it being financially viable for farmers, and I think it's just worth saying that there are quite a lot of funding mechanisms out there, not only for the introduction of and delivery of natural flood management by way of DEFRA funding, local levy, grant in aid type schemes, but also things like countryside stewardship can really help support farmers, implement such schemes. Okay, we've got a few more coming in there. We've got another question then from Deborah, which says, do the panel feel the removal of feed-in tariffs, which help to recover installation costs, has made installation of renewable energy sources less viable for the public and potentially reduce the installation rate of renewable sources? What can be done to overcome this? Branka, your Linlithgow case study looked in particular at renewable, or as one of the facets. I wondered whether you would be able to come in on this question from Deborah.
Well, there were different approaches and different developments regarding feed-in tariff, and at one point it stimulated setting up wind turbines anywhere because people were interested in generating some income from wind turbines, and that also triggered some reactions, especially in Scotland, because people were sensitive to how these wind turbines were located, where they were located. I believe there was similar reactions in England. So benefits of providing such incentives have also to be weighed against the impacts that they might have that might not have been envisaged at the time when they were introduced. So I think that that has to be taken on board when deciding in future on any potential incentives, that maybe wider consultation now after we have more experience of potential impacts, especially on landscapes, let's say, of the impacts of wind turbines, that that could be considered. However, there are opportunities and incentives and financial support for improving energy efficiency. There is also support, for example, from Historic Environment Scotland for installing devices for energy generation from renewables in historic context. And on their website, they published several years ago guidelines on how to install solar panels, heat pumps, and so on. So I think we just have to be to follow what is going on in relation to the research and outputs of innovations in this area and how applicable they are in practice. And in that sense, feed-in tariffs or other incentives have to accommodate all these changes and look for the most positive impacts.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we've got some more questions coming through then, which is great to see. So Colin's posted two, so thank you, Colin. Firstly then to Shruti, interesting ideas. It says, is there any view on the effectiveness and impact of using the tool for very small communities? Ours is 150 people with no online access. I'm wondering how easy it would be to use the tool.
Yeah, so we have examples of how the tool has been used in larger areas, but also smaller areas as well. We've also heard of one individual using the tool themselves to determine whether they should buy a particular house in a place. So it can be used at a different number of geographical scales, and in urban and in rural areas. I think traditionally the tool would have been used in workshop settings where people meet face to face, and in community halls and in community centres or even on the street. And obviously we're now in a new world where we've all been at home, or we're all kind of working in a social distancing way. So I think absolutely, you can use it with a small community, and it has been used with a small community. And I think it would be really interesting to explore how you could do that within the kind of current kind of eased lockdown setting and with social distancing in place. Just to give you an example of how it was used quite creatively in Leith down on the streets, there was a really big version of the wheel that was printed up, and it was displayed on an easel on a street in Leith, and people were asked to come along and to consider the 14 themes, or even just a couple of the themes that were most relevant to them, and then literally just write a marker or just to indicate on a scale of 1 to 7 how they felt that public transport was in Leith. And if they wanted to provide a note to support that kind of score, then they could do that and attach that either to the diagram or pop it in a box. But that was a really quick and fun and creative and exciting way for people to take part in a place-landed tool assessment without having to kind of be in a room together with people. So I think moving forward, we're all going to have to think about how we engage better online. And how we kind of hold conversations like this on place. But moving forward, it isn't just going to be online. There's probably going to be a mix of offline and online kind of engagement. So I think having no access to online is absolutely fine. So I did highlight that the tool is available online, but you can actually download it offline and you can use it offline. And that's the main way that people use and conduct the place standard assessment. If you didn't with enough detail and guidance from some of the case studies that are illustrated in the slides that'll be circulated after the webinar, then just give me, drop me an email, and I'm more than happy to just have a chat through how you can kind of work through it in a practical way. But you can do it. You can do it in half an hour. You can do it in an hour. You can spend half of the day. You can spend a whole week on it, and it's up to you. But the framework's there for you to kind of use in lots of creative ways.
Excellent. And whilst we're talking about the tool, then, if you don't mind, Shrita, a quick question from me, actually. I was fascinated to hear that the next incarnation, the next version of it is considering climate change. And I wondered whether, and I know you mentioned a sort of a trial in Perth and Kinross, but I wondered, has it been used in post-flood situations, or have there been aspirations to do that with this next iteration? And I'm simply thinking that having visited flood-affected communities in the last week, their sense of space and place and geography for all parts of their lives are quite disrupted at that point in time. And so I think that would be a fascinating point and juncture at which to sort of introduce the tool to them.
Okay. So just to clarify, there are two pieces of work that we're doing with the tool. So that the main version of the tool, we've done some work on that to strengthen climate aspects within that tool, and then we're producing a bespoke resource which will be a apply standard tool with a climate lens, and
right,
provide the detail that that we've heard back that people need to have a really focused and detailed conversation on climate adaptation. So no, we haven't done what you're suggesting.
Sorry, can I just come in?
Sure, absolutely. I say, yeah.
Because we actually did some work a few years ago with Sniffer to look at the play standard tool, and identifying the climate change was really something that communities were very keen on. So we produced a separate guidance that could be used, and in terms of capturing some of the issues that happened in the borders, like in Jedburgh, where you have a particular flooding prone area. So I think it's great. It's now moving on, and it's actually going to have an iteration where climate change can be used, because the communities out there are definitely wanting to see that. Yeah.
Definitely. Excellent. Okay. We have one more question from Colin. Thank you, Colin. Personal flood plans. Is this working in conservation areas? Is it practical, or does it need additional expert guidance, which can be difficult to access? I'm happy to take that one on. I think there's two elements at play here, Colin. I think firstly, on the point of personal flood plans, which is how does a homeowner or indeed business, but probably a homeowner, plan and respond. I think actually a lot of the actions relating are not specific to conservation areas per se, in terms of moving valuables, moving cars, having insurance documents to hand, and so on and so forth. But I think perhaps the point that you're getting at is around property flood resilience, which are the measures which can reduce the damage to things like barriers and gates and non-return valves, which indeed one of the barriers is indeed in conservation areas and listed buildings, where clearly the design needs to be sympathetic to the conservation area or the listed building. So you're absolutely right, Colin. In those older buildings, perhaps which are more porous, which are maybe listed, bring with them conservation area status, then absolutely we do need to be bringing on board heritage consultants. We need to be making sure that listed building consent is in place, that the local conservation officer is on board and happy with what's being recommended, not just from an aesthetic perspective in terms of maintaining that character and conservation, conservation of that, but also in terms of the fabric of the building as well. So it's a very good point, Colin. Yeah.
And can I just add to this, because
Sure.
it is definitely something that I'm feeling quite exercised by, living in a conservation area myself. I would like to install how do you call it, solar panels, but because it's a listed building, I have from a personal point of view, there's a real dilemma between conservation and building and making our communities resilient, whether it's energy conservation or whether it's flood plains and so on. So this is something we need to discuss, I think, at the wider level, definitely.
Yeah, you're right in saying it's not just restricted to flood risk. It's wider. Okay, we have got a question here from Francis. which says, given that sandbags are no longer recommended, how will the funding for installation of PFR infrastructure be achieved? Do you see national government helping on this? Now, I can see Kirsty is typing a reply to this, so thank you, Kirsty. I was happy to jump in, but I'm more than happy to wait and see what your text response on this is. Fundamentally, whilst Kirsty's typing, we are starting to see investment from certainly south of the border. We are starting to see investment from the likes of the Environment Agency and local authorities using that PFR framework that I mentioned earlier through grant funding for communities, but also often post-flood. We've seen post-flood grants made available for £5,000 for homeowners to actually install PFR measures. It is retrospective, of course, but nevertheless, it's an opportunity to help build back better for next time. Be that internally raising electrics, tiling the floor, or externally keeping it out. I see Kirsty is still typing there, but there's also a socio-economic component to this, that clearly it can't all be left up to the homeowner to pick up the tab. So that's why I think, you know, local and national governments do have a responsibility. It is an effective part of flood risk management, and so working down that hierarchy that I mentioned at the top, if a community isn't eligible on a cost benefit ground for traditional flood defence schemes, then the appraisal then needs to consider, well, what next? And if the community is, let's say, a small community with 15 houses at risk, the likelihood is it's probably not going to benefit for a £2 million flood defence scheme, and that's understood. So it's then about, well, what can be done, what is achievable, and what can the local authority or the national government provide by way of funding. And I've just seen Kirsty's reply there. It says, one of many options being looked at. Scotland looking at options at many levels. Sorry, tricky to write a full answer to that. No, that's absolutely fine, Kirsty, and thank you for joining in the conversation on the text. I know you're having trouble with your connections. So I would invite more text questions to come through, but whilst we're doing that, I would just I have just noticed that that Barbara has just raised a question about having intermittent connection problems as well, so has missed some of the slides, and it's just to reassure that the slide packs and the recording from today is going to be circulated and posted. I understand that everyone will get a copy of the slides, and I think the recording is actually going to be made available on YouTube ultimately as well. I think that's the intention. So I know that that Andy will follow up in due course on disseminating. So fear not, you won't worry, you won't miss anything. And Andy has also just posted on there, if there are any case studies that any of our speakers want to share, he can arrange for those to be included in the email along with the videos and the presentations as well. So yeah, perhaps offline we can have a think about that. Okay, no more questions have come through. Perhaps a question that I could close on then, I suppose, for all speakers really. I think, Petra, it was you that in one of your first slides, you mentioned how we are starting to see a gap potentially between more resilient and less resilient communities. And I think there's probably a whole PhD thesis in this if we wanted to. But I'm interested, I suppose, in everyone's thoughts on perhaps why we're starting to see a gap, and perhaps how we can close that gap. What can we learn from response to risk management that we've seen thus far? And I'm not just talking about flood risk. Obviously, it's wider. It's health. It's the built environment as well. To try and improve resilience, and coming back to some of the slides that I presented in terms of normalizing a resilient mindset, I presented that in the context of flood risk, but widening that out, if we're trying to normalize a resilient mindset in terms of wider climate change issues, perhaps what some of our opportunities and our aspirations could be around that. So I suppose I'd just welcome some comments from fellow speakers on that really. I'm not sure if anyone wants to go first.
I'm happy to go first if you want.
Thank you.
I just want to say, I mean, we're working obviously with a lot of communities across Scotland, but one of the most deprived communities at this moment in time is the Gypsy Traveller communities, partly because of how they are living in terms of their proximity and also in terms of their location. But then what I want to see more of is this kind of understanding that there's one community that has this particular set of problems, and for an adjacent community who is settled, maybe in a conservation area, for understanding better and more accurately what's actually really happening. So we're not just judging one community against another with our own set of values and our own set of experiences. And I guess this is going to be particularly important over the next 5 to 10 years, where we see more climate refugees arriving in Western Europe. And I think in order to build a better cohesive community that really allows us to understand and be, supportive of each other, we need to start having a dialogue. We're currently putting a program together for this is on transport issues, working with 10 most deprived communities in Scotland to look at how can communities almost like relearn the activities of walking and cycling and food growing and building activism across then to other communities who then can help each other. Because I think for too often we're always looking for, other organizations to come in and help, whereas actually we should flip it around and say communities have to help themselves. What is it that we need to do to ensure that it can happen? Provide knowledge, but ideally leave capacity. So that's it.
No, I fully endorse that. Yeah, absolutely. Shruti, Branka, do either of you want to perhaps come in on that point?
I think I'd probably just echo what Petra's been saying, is that we probably need to understand that we already have a great number of inequalities across Scotland and in our communities, and those have been exacerbated by COVID, and they will be further exacerbated by the recession, as you indicated in that slide. So the slide of the waves that's happening, and then furthermore by climate change. So climate change is the biggie that sits across COVID and the recession. And we need to understand the challenges that communities are facing, not to go in with any assumptions or judgments, etc., but to work together to understand what the issues are and to identify some of the solutions, and not to plug the Place Standard tool again, but that provides a really valuable resource to be able to have a conversation across those issues, not only for climate and resilience and tackling inequalities, but also improving people's health and well-being. But critically moving forward, our public purse was already quite, well, it was beginning to shrink. It's shrunk a lot more now, and it's going to continue to shrink. So that need to work together collaboratively as we move forward at all levels is even more imperative now than ever before. It's the issues won't go away. They're only going to get bigger, and we've seen that happen over the last 4 or 5 months. So yes, the need to work together, the need to understand the issues better, and to begin to identify those solutions, and help everyone realise that everyone's got a role to play in kind of enabling some of that action. Yeah.
Thank you. And Branko, I know you wanted to just come in.
Yes, I think that what I've seen, for example, in Linlithgow, is that's a small town of 15,000 people that has different levels of wealth, and amidst I would say maybe middle class community, there are areas of social deprivation. But what was also very interesting and good to see is that community group, Transition Linlithgow, really focused on those areas that needed most help. And the district heating scheme that they were developing was really for social housing in Linlithgow. So solidarity is something that has emerged stronger in this current situation. And we see that in many ways. We have seen that in many ways in the last few months. And that's something that should be supported, and communities also help to organize, help them to organize themselves, because we are also aware, well, in Scotland, that there are areas of social housing that are like satellites around cities, not really integrated in with other better well-off areas. And they might not have capabilities always, or place or space to meet, to organize, to be engaged, really. And so helping them maybe to have their similar transition groups or whatever we want to call them, but engagement groups, establishing them, supporting them, and encouraging changing of experiences between different communities of their food growing or energy efficiency measures or and so on would be something that would help communities that do not have capabilities to engage sufficiently in the whole process of decision making.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks everyone. So looking to probably sort of draw this to a conclusion then, I suppose I would just invite any of the other three speakers if they have any final remarks that they would like to make, and then I'll as chair I'll just sort of put my own final remarks in place. But I'll just open it up in turn. So Petra, I don't know if you have any final remarks you'd like to make from what you've heard from fellow speakers.
I think, I mean, the theme today was resilience, and I think what I feel very strongly is that we can't differentiate climate change, emergency, and human rights, and the whole things are connected, and we will see it more and more playing to the forefront. So environmental protection is very, very important, but so is equality, and we need to make sure that we are mindful of that.
Yeah, excellent. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. Shruti, any final remarks from you?
I don't think I have anything else to say.
No, that's great, and thank you for your contributions today. And Branka, then just opportunity for you.
Yes, well, just to say that I think it's important to engage also researchers and our universities in these kinds of conversations and to be able to contribute with outcomes of this research that is going on to find new and appropriate solutions.
Yeah, definitely. Good. Thank you. So I suppose as chair then, I have the honour of thanking all of our speakers today. It's been a fascinating series of talks. The consequences of climate change are now well known and well recognised, and will have global impacts. Local impacts will indeed be very different to the challenges on the international scale, but they continue to be highlighted by the extreme weather that we keep seeing, flooding events, and these have put climate change on the political agenda. It is here to stay, and I think coming back to two of the threads from today's theme, one is around normalizing and mainstreaming the conversation around all elements of resilience to climate change, and I do pose that question again about what we can learn from other industries. I used fire as an analogy, but I think there's a lot that can be learned and should be learned potentially. But also I'm gonna just paraphrase Shruti's talk from earlier, when I think, Shruti, you said we need to do our work with communities rather than to them, and I think that's the place where we can close today. I think that's a lovely message to end on today. So I'd like to thank all speakers again, and thank you, Kirsty, for your contributions, even though I know you've not been able to join us, but I know you'll record separately offline. I'd like to thank our sponsors today, PAS, the Architecture and Design Scotland, and also the Scottish Flood Forum. I'd also like to thank Andy as well, and his team at Impact Engagement for putting the session on today. As I say, the slides and the recording will be made available, but if you do have any final questions that want to come through offline, then I'm sure they can be directed to Andy and they can be posted over to us. So thank you again, everybody, and I hope you found it an enjoyable and an interesting session today. And we'll see you all soon.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.